Henry Caldwell was a man who'd made peace with dying alone. At 68, the old rancher felt the weight of his years in every creak of his joints, every labored breath. His sprawling Nebraska ranch, tucked between rolling hills and endless cornfields, had been his sanctuary and his prison for 3 decades. The townsfolk of Willow Creek called him a recluse, a bitter old man who'd rather scare off visitors with a shotgun than share a cup of coffee. Henry didn't care. He'd lost his wife, Margaret, and their son, Thomas, to a fire that gutted their home 30 years ago. Since then, he'd built walls around his heart as sturdy as the oak fences circling his land. That crisp October morning, as Henry sat on his porch sipping black coffee, the sunrise painted the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. He was 3 days from death, or so his doctor had warned, citing a heart too weak to carry him through another winter. Henry had accepted it, even welcomed it. But as he watched the light creep across his fields, he didn't know a small, silent figure was already crossing his property, her footsteps muffled by the dew-soaked grass. At 7:15, the barn door groaned open. The sound cut through the morning stillness, sharp and unnatural. Henry's hand instinctively reached for the rifle propped against the porch railing. No one came to his ranch anymore, not neighbors, not deliverymen, not even the pastor who'd once tried to save his soul. He stood, his knees protesting, and made his way to the barn, weapon in hand. If someone was trespassing, they'd regret it. Inside, the barn was dim, the air thick with the scent of hay and old leather. Henry's eyes adjusted to the shadows, and then he saw here a girl, no more than 11, standing in the center of the barn. Her clothes were ragged, a torn jacket and jeans caked with mud. Her blonde hair was matted with leaves, and her blue eyes held a fear so raw it stopped Henry in his tracks. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her fist, her small body trembling but defiant. She didn't flinch at the rifle, didn't speak. Instead, she extended the note with shaking hands. Henry lowered his weapon, his arthritis screaming as he stepped closer. The handwriting was uneven, desperate. "Please help Abigail. Bad men took her mama. She can't hear or speak. Trust no one in town. They're coming." He looked up at the girl. Abigail, the note said. Her eyes were locked on his lips, reading them. She was deaf, just as the note claimed. But there was something else in her gaze, a loneliness so profound it mirrored Henry's own. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of something he'd buried long. A connection. The distant rumble of an engine snapped them both to attention. Abigail's eyes widened, and she grabbed Henry's calloused hand with surprising strength. Through the barn's slatted walls, Henry saw a black SUV approaching, its tires crunching gravel. 3 men climbed out, their faces hard and purposeful. The driver wore a sheriff's badge, and Henry recognized him instantly. Deputy Carl Ramsey, a man whose questions about missing families in Willow Creek had always felt appointed. Too predatory. Abigail's grip tightened, and Henry understood. These were the bad men from the note. The barn door swung open, and Ramsey stepped inside, his hand resting on his holster. 2 men flanked him, their eyes scanning the barn like hawks. "Morning, Caldwell," Ramsey said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "Heard you might have seen something odd today." Henry leaned on a shovel, playing the part of the cranky hermit. "Only odd thing I see is you on my land without an invite." Ramsey's smile was cold. "We're looking for a girl, about 11, blonde. Might be lost, confused. Her family had an accident. We're trying to get her back to her kin." The word accident sent a chill down Henry's spine. He glanced at Abigail, hidden now behind a stack of feed sacks where he'd gestured for her to hide. Her stillness told him everything she'd learned to disappear, to survive. "Ain't seen no girl," Henry said, his voice flat. "Don't get visitors. Too busy minding my own business." One of Ramsey's men, a weary guy with a scar across his cheek, smirked. "Heard about your heart, old man. Shame you're gonna die out here, all alone. But that gives us an idea." He exchanged a look with Ramsey. "What if folks thought you passed yesterday? Natural cousins, real peaceful like." The threat hung heavy. Ramsey stepped closer, close enough for Henry to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "If you're already dead, no one's gonna care when we tear this place apart. And if we find what we're looking for," Henry's heart pounded. Not from fear, but from a fury he hadn't felt in decades. These men, cloaked in authority, were hunting a child. "I told you," he said slowly, "I ain't seen no girl." Ramsey studied him, then nodded to his men. "Search it. Every corner, every bale," as they began ripping through the barn. Overturning tools and kicking hay, Henry saw Abigail shift slightly. She was preparing to bolt, but there was nowhere to run. The men had them cornered, and Henry knew helping her might be his final act. The weary man was inches from Abigail's hiding spot when Henry acted. He accidentally knocked over a metal bucket, sending it clattering across the floor. The noise drew all three men's attention, their hands snapping to their guns. "Clumsy old fool," Ramsey growled. In that moment, Abigail slipped from her hiding place and darted behind a tractor, silent as a ghost. But Henry knew it was only seconds before they spotted her. Ramsey picked up a coil of rope, his eyes glinting. "Maybe you need some convincing, Caldwell." The rope lashed across Henry's shoulder, pain flaring through his frail body. He'd endured worse grief, guilt, 30 years of isolation, but this was different. Abigail was counting on him. "Go ahead," Henry said, meeting Ramsey's gaze. "Beat an old man. That's what cowards with badges do, ain't it?" The words stung. Ramsey's face twisted, and he raised the rope again. But one of his men shouted from the back, "Boss, found something." Henry's heart stopped. But the man held up an old cigar box, not Abigail. Inside was a faded photo of Henry with Margaret and Thomas, taken before the fire. Ramsey snatched it, sneering. "Well, look at this. Our loner wasn't always alone." "What happened, Caldwell? Couldn't keep em safe?" The cruelty cut deeper than the rope. Grief surged, but Henry forced it down. Abigail was signaling him now, tapping her fingers in a pattern he didn't understand. Near the barn's rear exit, she was planning something, but Ramsey followed Henry's gaze. "What are you looking at, old man?" His gun was out now, his boots stalking toward the tractor. Time was up. Henry grabbed the shovel and swung with all of his might, catching Ramsey across the back. The deputy stumbled, his gun skidding across the dirt. The other men drew their weapons, shouting, "Move, and you're dead." But Abigail was already running, bursting through the rear exit. A shot rang out, splintering wood above her head, but she vanished into the fields. Ramsey, back on his feet, wiped blood from his brow. "Big mistake, Caldwell. Now we hunt her down, and you get to watch." "Witness to what?" Henry demanded, pieces falling into place. Ramsey's grin was pure malice. "To what happened to her folks. To what happens to families who don't pay up. That girl saw it all, burned homes, dead parents. She's the last loose end." Henry's blood ran cold. The missing families, the unexplained fire, it was all Ramsey's doing. A corrupt deputy covering up murder. "How many?" Henry asked, voice low. "How many families?" Ramsey shrugged. "Enough to keep business running. Folks who don't pay protection fees learn the hard way." He turned to his men. "She's heading for the river. Fast, but she won't get far on foot." To Henry, he raised his gun. "First, we deal with you." Henry closed his eyes, picturing Margaret and Thomas. If this was his end, saving Abigail was worth it. But then, a new sound, hooves, dozens of them, thundering closer. Ramsey froze, his confidence cracking. Through the barn's front, Henry saw dust rising from the road. "Who the hell is that?" the weary man muttered. Through the rear exit, Henry glimpsed Abigail by the riverbank, no longer running. She held a piece of broken glass, flashing sunlight in a pattern. She was signaling someone. Ramsey saw it too, his face paling. "It's a trap," he whispered. "That kid set us up." The riders arrived, 8 men on horseback, their faces weathered and resolute. These weren't Ramsey's allies. The leader, a grizzled man with a white beard, dismounted with purpose. "Deputy Carl Ramsey," he called, voice like gravel. "You're a hard man to find." Henry realized Abigail hadn't stumbled onto his ranch by chance. She'd led Ramsey into a trap, and these men were here to finish it. Word count for Part 1, 5,000 to 100. Part 2, the reckoning. The leader of the riders stepped into the barn, his boots echoing on the dirt floor. "I'm Colonel Samuel Hayes," he said, his gray eyes locked on Ramsey. "These are my men, state investigators. You're under arrest for murder, extortion, and treason against the people you swore to protect. Ramsey's gun hand trembled, but his voice stayed defiant. You got no authority here, Hayes. I'm a deputy sheriff. Hayes' laugh was bitter. That badge is as fake as your soul. The real sheriff's office has been after you since the Thompson family burned. You've been running a racket, Ramsey shaking down families, torching homes when they don't pay. And that girl? She's been leaving us clues for weeks. Henry's gaze flicked to Abigail, still by the riverbank. She wasn't just a victim. She was a strategist, a child who'd turned her silence into a weapon. Ramsey's men shifted nervously, but there was no escape. Hayes' investigators had the barn surrounded, rifles trained. Henry stood in the crossfire. An old man caught in a war he hadn't known was raging. The girl, Henry called to Hayes. She's safe, by the river. Hayes nodded, sending one of his men to retrieve her. Ramsey's desperation boiled over. You want a witness, Hayes? That kid saw her mama and daddy burn. She saw her little sister choke on smoke. And you know what? We laughed. The words were meant to wound, but Hayes didn't flinch. Surrender, Ramsey. Last chance. Instead, Ramsey lunged, grabbing Henry and pressing his gun to the rancher's temple. Here's the deal, you let us walk, or this old man dies. Henry felt the cold metal, but he wasn't afraid. Abigail's trust had changed him. Don't negotiate, Colonel, he said calmly. Do what's right. The barn erupted. Henry drove his elbow into Ramsey's gut, breaking free as gunfire exploded. Hayes' men fired with precision. The weary man took a bullet to the shoulder, collapsing into the hay. The third man tried to flee, but was cut down by a shot to the leg. Ramsey scrambled behind a barrel, returning fire. Henry crawled toward his shovel, pain searing his chest. A bullet grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve, but he thought only of Abigail. Ramsey bolted for the rear exit, aiming for Abigail. He knew she was his ticket out, a hostage to barter. But Henry was closer. With a strength he didn't know he had, he tackled Ramsey, both men crashing into the dirt. Ramsey's gun flew from his hand, and they grappled, Henry's vision blurring. Ramsey pinned him, hands around his throat. Should have stayed out of it, old man. But Henry wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for Abigail, for the family he'd lost, for every soul Ramsey had destroyed. His fingers found the shovel's handle. With a final surge, he drove it upward, the blade sinking into Ramsey's side. The deputy's eyes widened, blood bubbling at his lips. You killed me, he gasped. Yeah, Henry whispered. I did. Ramsey slumped, his breathing ragged. The gunfire ceased, and Hayes' voice cut through the silence, ordering his men to secure the barn. Henry rolled onto his back, staring at the rafters. His heart stuttered, each breath a struggle, but he felt free. For the first time in 30 years, he'd fought for something bigger than his pain. Hayes knelt beside him. Hold on, Caldwell. We'll get a doctor. Henry shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. No fixing this, Colonel. But the girlie's she safe, Hayes nodded. She's with my men. Brave kid. Been tracking Ramsey's crew, leaving signs notes, signals. Let us write to you. Henry's smile widened. Abigail was a warrior, a light in the darkness. Through the barn door, Henry saw Abigail approaching, escorted by 2 investigators. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes shone with hope. She knelt beside him, her small hand on his cheek. Her fingers moved in signs he couldn't read, but her gratitude was clear. Colonel, Henry rasped, she's got no one. When I'm gone, we'll take care of her, Hayes promised. There's a family in Lincoln, the Harrisons. Good folks, looking to adopt. She'll have a home. Abigail's fingers moved again, urgent. Hayes translated. She says she found your family's graves in the field. Been tending them, pulling weeds. A tear slipped down Henry's cheek. This child, who'd lost everything, had cared for Margaret and Thomas' memory. Colonel, Henry whispered, there's a tin box in my house, under the kitchen floorboards. Some money, not much. For her, Hayes nodded. We'll find it. Anything else? Henry looked at Abigail, her hands still in his. Tell her she gave me a reason to live, even if it was just for today. Abigail seemed to understand. She leaned forward, kissing his forehead, and pressed the crumpled note into his hand. On the back, in her careful scrawl, were new words. Thank you for seeing me. Mama said there are heroes who look like regular people. You're mine." Henry closed his eyes, peace washing over him. The pain faded, replaced by warmth. He wasn't alone anymore, not in this moment. Hayes' voice grew distant. "Caldwell, stay with us." But Henry was elsewhere, walking a familiar hill where the graves waited under a cottonwood tree. Margaret stood there, her smile radiant, Thomas beside her. No longer the boy lost to flames, but whole and strong. "You did good, Henry," Margaret said softly. "We're proud." Back in the barn, Henry's breathing stopped as the sun climbed high. Hayes closed his eyes, removing his head in respect. Abigail stood silent, tears falling onto Henry's chest. She walked to the corner where she'd hidden and retrieved a small bundle of wildflowers, goldard and asters, picked at dawn. She placed them on Henry's chest, a final gift. Hayes found the tin box as promised. Inside were $400 in silver dollars, a locket with Margaret and Thomas' photo, and a note: "I lived 30 years in shadows. Today, I remembered why I'm here. Protect the girl. She saved me." The investigators prepared to leave, but Abigail lingered by the graves of Margaret and Thomas, clearing weeds as she'd done for weeks. Now, she was preparing a third spot for Henry. Hayes found her there at dusk. "You don't have to stay, Abigail. We'll take you to Lincoln tonight." She shook her head, pointing to the house. She wanted one last night in the place that had sheltered her. Hayes agreed. "Tomorrow, we ride to the Harrisons. They've got a daughter your age. Kind folks." Abigail nodded, her eyes on the graves, saying goodbye to her past. That night, Abigail sat on Henry's porch, wrapped in his old quilt. The stars above felt closer, kinder. In her pocket were two notes, the one that brought her to Henry, and a new one for her future family. "My name is Abigail. I can't hear your voices, but I feel your hearts. A hero taught me to trust again." The next morning, as Hayes loaded her belongings onto his horse, Abigail took a final look at the ranch barn where she'd found refuge, the house where she'd known kindness, the hill where 3 souls rested. She pressed her hand to her heart, then her lips, blowing a kiss to Henry's grave. Henry Caldwell had spent 30 years believing he was alone. In his final hours, he learned the truth: no one is truly alone when they choose to fight for another. His ranch, once a place of sorrow, was now a monument to one perfect day when a dying man and a silent girl saved each other. 6 months later, the Nebraska spring brought life back to the fields around Henry Caldwell's ranch. The corn was sprouting, green tips piercing the soil, and the air carried the sweet scent of blooming lilacs. The ranch itself stood quiet, its barn and house untouched since that fateful October day. But it was no longer a place of sorrow. To the people of Willow Creek, it had become a simpler reminder that even in the darkest corners, courage could bloom. Abigail, now 12, stood on the porch of her new home in Lincoln, a modest farmhouse owned by the Harrisons. Clara Harrison, a warm woman in her late 50s with a knack for baking, had welcomed Abigail like a daughter. Her husband, George, a retired school teacher, spent evenings teaching Abigail sign language, building on the rudimentary signs she'd used to communicate with Henry. Their daughter Emily, a lively 11-year-old, had become Abigail's shadow, her best friend, and her interpreter. The Harrisons' home was filled with laughter, the kind Abigail hadn't known since before her parents' murder. But Abigail carried Henry's memory like a talisman. In her room, tucked inside a wooden box, were the 2 notes, the desperate plea that led her to Henry's barn, and the one she'd written to him, calling him her hero. Beside them was the locket from Henry's tin box, holding the faded photo of Margaret and Thomas. Clara had helped her polish it, and now it hung around Abigail's neck, a reminder of the family she'd lost and the one she'd found. That morning, Abigail sat at the kitchen table, sketching the ranch as she remembered its barn's weathered beams, the hill with 3 graves, the cottonwood tree standing sentinel. Clara glanced over her shoulder, smiling. "You've got a gift, Abigail. That's Henry's place, isn't it?" Abigail nodded, her fingers signing home. "Safe." Clara's eyes softened. "He'd be proud of you, you know. The way you're healing, the way you're living." Abigail's healing wasn't just personal, it had rippled through Willow Creek. Colonel Samuel Hayes and his investigators had dismantled Ramsey's corrupt network, arresting 6 more accomplices, including a town councilman who'd turned a blind eye to the extortion. The trials were ongoing, and Abigail's testimony, delivered through an interpreter, had been pivotal. She'd faced the courtroom with the same quiet strength she'd shown in Henry's barn, her signs steady as she recounted the night her family burned. The town, once complicit in its silence, was forced to confront its own failures. Hayes visited Abigail often, bringing updates and small gifts: a book, a carved horse. He'd kept his promise to Henry, ensuring the $400 in silver dollars went to Abigail's future, now a trust for her education. During one visit, he'd told her about Henry's past, how the fire that took Margaret and Thomas had broken him, how he'd chosen isolation over pain. "But you, Abigail," Hayes said, "you gave him back his purpose. That day in the barn, he wasn't just saving you. He was redeeming himself." Today, Abigail was returning to the ranch for the first time since Henry's death. Hayes had arranged it, knowing she needed closure. As the Harrisons' truck rolled up the familiar gravel drive, Abigail's heart raced. The barn looked smaller in the daylight, its scars from the gunfire barely visible. The hill beyond, where Henry rested beside Margaret and Thomas, was dotted with wildflowers, goldard and asters, like the ones she'd placed on his chest. Clara and Emily stayed by the truck, giving Abigail space. Hayes walked with her to the graves, his hat in hand. "Thought you might want to say goodbye proper," he said. Abigail knelt, her fingers brushing the new headstone Hayes had ordered for Henry Caldwell, 1957 to 2025. A hero who chose to fight. She pulled a small bundle from her pocket, more wildflowers, tied with twine, and laid them across the grave. Her signs were slow, deliberate. "Thank you. Always." As they walked back, Abigail paused at the barn, her eyes tracing the spot where she'd hidden, where Henry had swung the shovel, where everything had changed. She signed to Hayes, "This place, it's not empty." He nodded, understanding. "It's full of what you both did here. That's why we're preserving it, turning it into a community memorial, a place to remember what happens when good people stand up." Abigail smiled, a rare, radiant thing. She'd lost her family to violence, her voice to silence, but she'd gained something, to a belief that justice, though hard won, was possible. Henry had taught her that, and she'd carry it forward, just as she carried his locket. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold, Abigail climbed into the truck, her new family waiting. The ranch faded in the rearview, but its lessons stayed with her. Courage begins with a single choice, and no one is ever truly alone. She pressed her hand to the locket, feeling Henry's strength, and faced the road ahead, ready for whatever came next. We hope this story of resilience, redemption, and the fight against injustice resonated with you. What are your thoughts on the violence and corruption exposed in Willow Creek? Was Henry's sacrifice the only way to stop Ramsey? How should communities confront systemic injustice? Share your views in the comments. We're eager to hear your perspective on these vital issues. Subscribe for more powerful stories from the American heartland, and click the next video for another tale of courage that will stay with you long after the screen fades.